Thanks, guys. I want to call Tommaso, Alan, and Fabian up here to join you. We'll need an additional chair or two. And I'd like to open up the discussion to the floor. We also have some questions, I think, on the comment page of the YouTube live stream, which I'll ask Esther to pose. And I'd like to begin by asking Esther, perhaps, to pose a question from the live stream with perhaps a microphone.
Look at this.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay.
This whole
It's a conspiracy.
the U.S. loses its power. That's all I have to say about that. I don't know. Tim Cook's been spending a lot of time in the White House. It's very suspicious.
Yeah, so we collected some questions, and one perhaps for all of you, because it's also a lot about cultural differences on Wikipedia, yeah, we were wondering, how would you conceptualize perhaps also the English Wikipedia, which is a kind of also a language Wikipedia that is edited by a lot of different languages, perhaps, and yeah, maybe also from experience, or I don't know, is it a baseline, or is it North American, or is it a place where cultures meet or clash, or?
Yeah, nice question.
I definitely wouldn't call it a baseline. So the concepts are contextualized around my experience and that of Bernie's, right? Bernie's a Canadian who lives in England, and I'm an American who lives in the United States. That's who's primarily writing, and that's who they're writing to.
I would say it's not necessarily a baseline from a sort of a technical or fact-based point of view, but from a discursive point of view. I would say that it has a lot of hegemony to it. And part of that hegemony is not just in what is said, but why people go there. A lot of people would go to the English Wikipedia because they're learning Wikipedia and they think that that's the place to go. And so they go and edit there first, and then if they don't like it, then they leave. And if they do like it, then maybe then they'll start editing in their own language. So it has a certain social draw to it that makes it very active, very lively. But that doesn't necessarily make it correct, if you will.
Therein lies the rub, right? It is the best example of this model. But it also is, if you're going to want to use the best example, you have to play that game, right? And that game is culturally contextualized for English speakers. So
yeah.
That might be some of the tension.
And a certain kind of English speakers as well,
yes,
as we've
right.
addressed earlier.
Okay, is there a question from the floor? Anybody? Yes, there's a microphone.
In all your talks, you have considered many different language versions of Wikipedia. I've learned there are over 5,000 languages in the world. There are less than 300 language versions of Wikipedia. What will happen to the cultures of the people who speak of the languages that don't have a Wikipedia yet? There are some 4,700 languages at least.
What's the answer?
So I'll quickly answer, and then I'll shut up quickly. One area I work a lot in is actually not looking at the differences between the language editions, but looking at properties of Wikipedia and their effect on AI systems that use Wikipedia, artificial intelligence systems. And Wikipedia is really, really important to AI. It was a game changer. And so to answer your question directly, computers won't understand that language, and they won't understand those perspectives. And that, to me, is the bigger loss, actually, than the inability of these people who probably are less interested in using Wikipedia if they haven't started one yet, right? But the systems that they might want to use will be dumber, quite frankly.
I might add something. Not only it's related to what we discussed before of the English Wikipedia being so strong. I mean, people go to the English Wikipedia to look up things because they already expect their language not to be represented or their language not to be as complete as the English one. That's what I I do. I have the German Wikipedia. I still do it. So I think what is the real problem here is that people, there's a barrier, like an initial cost of doing your own language Wikipedia, which many languages that don't have one already will not they will not overcome that barrier, and that is dangerous in my point of view. And I think maybe we have to do that top down to incentivize that, because if I'm speaking a language that only 5,000 people speak or 10,000. That takes a huge amount of effort to start the Wikipedia in that language, and I don't think that will happen. And that is dangerous, I think. Because if I go to English then, and it's my second or my third language, that is hard to think that people would edit that.
In a weird way, we're kind of at like a sort of an ironic window, where we're almost at the point where we could get someone speaking to a computer long enough to get the computer to learn that language. But we're not really there yet. And so these languages are dying just at the cusp where people are furiously trying to transcribe them.
Speaking of irony, though, a lot of the reason those technologies work is because of Wikipedia. So the English Wikipedia is an amazing natural language processing resource, right? So, feedback loops.
Yeah, again, just yet another feedback loop. And of course, feedback loops create asymmetries and reinforce them. And this is going to be, unfortunately, one of those cases where those feedback loops are going to have negative consequences. They are.
We have another question from the live stream.
Yeah, so we have another question, and it's also perhaps also a bit about the medium and the social, and it's basically about the question: does the detection of controversy rely too much or much on what Wikipedians consider controversial?
Well, as I said, we are not. Contropedia is not performing detection of controversy on the whole Wikipedia. So, if it was the case, yeah, it would definitely be. It would definitely rely on what the Wikipedian thinks is controversial, and then it's a lot. But it's not. That's not the case. So now, the way Contropedia works is that we have a set of pages that is constantly updating on the demand of researchers. So now, what is controversial in Wikipedia is what is defined by researchers that get in touch with us, basically.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that question too. In our case, as you have now seen also in my talk, our project was started by the Web Wars project, and some of the other initiatives that I showed were conducted by cultural historians mainly. So the places where we started searching as cultural historians was elsewhere, in print media, also in social media, I think, but certainly not systematically in Wikipedia. And then we looked for the accompanying Wikipedia entries. So in our case, we simply started elsewhere.
Could I just follow up on that? Because the study that you mentioned that I did with Emina, so we studied the Srebrenica massacre, genocide, depending on which language version Wikipedia calls it, in the Serbian version, in the Bosnian version, and in the Dutch, as well as a few others. And we studied over the changes, the edit history, let's say, the changes to the articles, to put it less technically, over a 5 or 6 year period. And what we found was that the more edits that were made and the longer time that passed, the more polarized the articles became. The more particularistic, the more parochial, the more almost national, or not necessarily use that term. Is this something that you would expect, or is this something that could be explained because of the sort of editing dynamics of Wikipedia itself? So this is a question that then relates to, is it the medium that's actually stirring up controversy? It's a different way of phrasing the question. Is it the medium itself because of the way the editing is organized? Or would you actually expect there to be, because of intercultural relations, however defined, greater polarization over time?
Yeah, I think in our project what we argued, and what Dunajewski, whom I cited, who wrote about Wikipedia, also argued, is that it is this type of behavior or this dynamics is defined by what you could call the memory landscape or the memory scape of Central and Eastern Europe. So she argued, and others in the project also argued, that especially in Central and Eastern Europe, because you don't have public consensus about recent history, you have these social media dynamics of what I mentioned, holivori, so flaming wars, which are absolutely only become more polarized the longer they last. So I think what we said in our project was that indeed this is not necessarily Wikipedia dynamics. On the other hand, some of the things that I discussed today is that I'm critical. I mean, I love doing that project and I think it's a very valuable project, but I'm critical of our own project because I think we sort of brought out what we had found, but there's not that much cooperation with media scholars in that, or computational scholars in that project. So I would actually be curious to hear what others would have expected. Is that indeed typical for Central and Eastern Europe, or is it a Wikipedia thing?
I would say it's both. It's certainly related to the topic, and not only to Wikipedia, but Wikipedia has its specific ways of inducing controversies, like, for example, the watch list features, and also the mindset of people is very much on protecting. There is papers that talk about territoriality of content, and if you see something that is your own content and it's getting changed, then you're gonna react, and then you have these watch list things where you always hover over your and you also have a social structure in Wikipedia that most people sometimes forget. The power editors, they know each other, and they had their differences in the past, and that might come up.
Well, just if I may, because you want to also jump in, right? So a lot of the power editors on Wikipedia are sent into dispute zones to tame them. Yeah. So because they're really experienced and they know how to deal with conflict. But if you leave certain Wikipedia language versions to their own, that's when, this is now a hypothesis. I wanted to see what you. That's when they become more extremist or parochial or particularistic. If you get the power editors from the larger community coming in, they'll tend to tame.
So, just real quickly.
Which one do you want? There you go.
One thing we should be doing is actually celebrating the conflict, right? Because in the Serbia and Croatia situation is a great example. Those languages are mutually understandable, but because they're separate languages, right, they're allowed to have different language editions, which means they're allowed to come to their own consensus. Whereas in other languages, right, like English, like German, like French, like Dutch, right, we have to agree. And, you know, in the modern landscape, I don't want to get into the filter bubble stuff, but in the modern landscape, right, at least within the United States, there's so little opportunity for that, right? It's American football and Wikipedia. That's it. There's the only sort of, that's the common ground. Yeah. So the conflict is in my view, just a wonderful thing. That's not me with my computer science hat. That's me with my sort of citizen hat on.
Well, I think plus in Central and Eastern Europe, in offline media, you're just not allowed to have conflicts. So these are the places where you can have them. So I think that's a very relevant point that you're raising.
And just a small footnote. So the Montenegrins tried 7 times, I believe it was, to get their own Wikipedia language version, and they were denied. Huh? So it's not that
denied?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because it was not considered to be enough of a language, despite the fact. So it's also the definition of what counts as language for you to actually have a Wikipedia language version. The small footnote.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
I can't see any circumstance under which more content is going to lead to less conflict. There's a limit to the things that we can have consensus upon. And in this particular case, I only studied this in a very tertiary sense, as in the use of Wikipedia in classrooms in Serbia, but close enough. The professors were frustrated by Wikipedia because it was a challenge to their authority. And the older the professor, the more likely it is that they would be frustrated by this. And some of that is just, I'm old, I've been doing this for 30 years, why am I being challenged now? I've never been challenged before. But another is, for me, I think a real generational shift towards postmodernism that has now successfully percolated into culture. And so we're seeing a lot of that in the West, in England, in the US now, with challenges to whether things should be free speech, whether free speech should contain hateful speech, whether we can fundamentally agree on things. And the more content you give people, the more things you can do to frustrate people and find reasons to antagonize them. And then the more people that are in this, the more they will want to take a side. And so it's not merely Wikipedia, but I suspect it is a lack of affordances for commonalities and a great deal of affordances for a lot of differences, including a lot of fundamental differences. I cannot change a lot of things about myself, but those are precisely the things that I'm going to put up on a Wikipedia page to show you who I am, which is going to reinforce the idea that I am these markers and you are those markers, and then we start splitting on just about everything, it seems, these days.
Yeah, okay.
Is there a...
Yeah, so we're discussing the questions that are coming in.
Is there another question? I just want to just footnote something, just another really briefly. If you remember the Contropedia graphs, and when there's editing activity, there are sort of bell curves, largely on each article. So it's not like the editing goes on forever, right? So it at some point does stop and it matures, and people move on for a lot of articles.
But they move on out of exhaustion.
Well, I mean, whether it's the politics of knowledge or the politics of exhaustion doesn't matter.
It depends. The articles achieve consensus or the people achieve consensus are not necessarily the same thing.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying they've moved on because of consensus.
Hurricanes don't say climate change in them on the English Wikipedia. They don't say they're because climate change, because there is one man who is relentless in deleting any reference to climate change increasing the frequency of hurricanes across all of the English Wikipedia. And no one can really do much about it because he is relentless and he's not against the rules.
Okay, we'll have to look that one up. Study that for
So this is again the combination. You're right, and there has been papers showing that this follows this spikes in controversies, whatever the reason, but that's commonly what's happening. But I think that happened also in natural language when we argue. At one point we get exhausted, or we said, okay, now I don't want to argue. We can't agree on something at least. But it's also a part of the rule set of Wikipedia. So Wikipedia also has rules. They will get administrators in. There's rules against edit warring. There's the 3 revert rule, maximum 3 reverts, etc., etc. So it's a mixture of those two things, I think.
And if I can add a little thing, something that we observed in Contropedia in many articles, and Esther and Eric wrote a very nice paper on it, is also that there often controversy moves from one page to the other. So that spike version that you see, it's because the power user of the Wikipedia moves the controversy in a separate page, sometimes called controversy about something. So first the controversy was in the global warming page, and then they move it to controversy on global warming, so that it's, which is a sort of a very explicit policy that they use to diffuse controversy, or at least to move them from the main articles to the sort of side articles.
I'll add a quick thing. One fun thing about Omnipedia I didn't talk about is that while these folks who delete climate change and hurricane articles can get to the English Wikipedia, they have a lot harder of a time doing it in Chinese. And so if you look at Omnipedia, right, you can see, well, why is hurricane mentioned in 24 languages but not English? These types of things. We encountered, I drink a lot of Diet Coke, and my partner in crime on Omnipedia, a woman named Patty Bao, now works at Google, she typed in, we're looking, when you have something like this, right, I'm sure you guys have all faced this, when you have a Wikipedia based system, it's like, well, what should I search for to do my test? And you look at your environment. It's like with Diet Coke. We noticed that a whole bunch of European languages discussed a relationship between Diet Coke and cancer that was not in the English Wikipedia, kind of conspicuously not in the English Wikipedia. And I don't know if it's, we looked into it. The science seemed not conclusive, but it definitely made an impact.
Okay, questions? You have one from the live stream?
Yeah, there are a few questions, and maybe I'll just pose the most recent one, and that is very much about translation of articles. And I want to first more broadly would like to ask for your views about this, translating articles into other languages? And then a question from the stream is, isn't the amount of interlinkages between articles also influenced by the fact whether the article was translated from another language and what specific language it was translated from? So what the original article being translated, or whether it is different versions that actually each have tell their own story.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. And do your systems account for translation of articles or not?
So, translation is an interesting topic, right? There are a number of research projects out there that that have built systems that try to help people, right? So, everything from really straightforward things like making it just easy to have two windows open and linking the sentences to more complex stuff. My view about translation is if it's a native speaker translated from English, say, they can do the contextualization. They say the English article talks about Hershey's and Cadbury. I'm going to change this to something else, right? The Dutch example that comes to mind is, yeah, of course there are going to be some similar sentences between the Dutch and the English language editions, but the Dutch one has a sentence about, we learned this from Wikipedia, has a sentence about blue wrappers being milk chocolate and red wrappers being dark chocolate. Is that correct? And I have a Dutch cousin. I email her, is this actually correct? And she says, yes, that's actually true. And so like you can, if you translate English straight into Dutch, you add that sentence in there, that's fine by me, right? So to me, it's essentially, it's part of the process, right?
That also points to a question of relevance, which we always include. Like we say it's contextualization, and there's this old question. We once studied bias in Wikipedia, like with these concepts. And what is actually bias? For example, you can ask what is bias and what coverage actually constitutes bias. So do you have to have these concepts in the Wikipedia? Do you have all of the concepts in the Wikipedia? Do you have to have Hershey's in all language editions? Is a question that you cannot answer. You cannot force Wikipedians to do that. You can say, okay, you have to be more diverse, but in the end, it doesn't matter to anyone. And the same thing, we excluded it a little bit, is also controversies about what articles should be written. There are also controversies about that. And this is something which also very much changes the perception of the world of the people that read in this language. Like the German one, for example, is very exclusionist. They're really hard to get articles into. Whereas the English one is, I think, quite inclusionist, so they actually let many
relative to German.
Relative to German.
Relative to German.
My favorite quote from the German Wikipedia community is, the English seeks to be the biggest, we seek to be the best.
Yes. Which also reflects this reflects on the policies that they actually write down and how the people behave. And you can also see it, for example, in change systems. Like in German, you can enter a change in the Wikipedia, but it has to be reviewed before it actually appears. So you should keep in mind these technical things as well. We always talk about cultures and how it directly reflects, but the system changes a lot of this. Yeah, sure. And also, another thing, there are lots of tools that people use, or gadgets that you can use in the English Wikipedia that are not available in other languages, for example. And this all also influences, of course. Yeah.
Is there a final question? We're coming up to the end of the... Yeah, do you have a...
Yes, hi. Thanks very much for all your contributions. I had a small question, mostly regarding the relentless guy who keeps...
Ken Mample.
Yeah, maybe we should name him. No, because that kind of... to me, it sounds like kind of the open democratic structure, which is kind of fundamental. Also is kind of flawing the whole thing, because that seems like a very essential thing to kind of connect to each other, hurricanes and climate change. So then it came to mind this beautiful quote from a writer called Sebald, a German writer, who basically states that every human endeavor can easily turn into its own opposite, or is kind of essentially flawed whilst being realized. Do you see such a kind of root, let's say, fundamental flaws in the Wikipedia project as well, or is it a perfect situation?
A poetic, dialectic final note.
Yes, I do think it's. I think it's flawed. I think we need to appreciate its flaws and just accept them. There's a real challenge. That challenge is reinforced by some people whose ideas or ideology is still very positivist and very modern, really committed to the one answer. Now, on one of the slides earlier, someone mentioned Turing as one of these 20th century thinkers, almost in this vein. Was that you, Tommaso? What was that you had? Who had Turing up?
I was in another session.
It was this morning. It was this morning stuff. That's right. Yes, but I mean, Turing, along with Gödel, you know, incompleteness theorem. There's certain limits to knowledge and we've established those in a number of arenas. Wikipedia's, if we know that there are limitations to knowledge universally, what pretense can we have to containing all of knowledge on Wikipedia under the pretense that we can contain it all and can make a sort of this ideal platform? I think rather what we should consider is Wikipedia as a practice of trying to find consensus rather than as the end result of consensus. And it is through that practice and the many ways that it experiments. In some Wikipedians it's moderated, such as the Arabic, as opposed to the Egyptian Arabic or in German. And some ways it isn't. Some places there's more votes than others. And it's in that practice of how we deal with the inability for us to achieve a pure consensus that I think Wikipedia is at its most compelling.
Ellen?
So respond to that. Yeah, I think for my work, the segment of Wikipedia that I've been looking at, and my colleagues, I think especially I think it's called the Shirky-Morozov discussion was very important. So this discussion about, are social media good or bad for people is sort of a very brief summary of that debate. And I think that my impression has been from what I've been reading that Wikipedia in, for instance, Russia and Ukraine, the countries that I've been looking at most, is incredibly empowering and incredibly tricky at the same time, because there's lots of trolling, intervention from the authorities. And in that capacity, with that tension in it, I really appreciate its existence, but I have no idea in which direction it will develop or move.
I really like that because it seems so often, at least in computer science, if something has a flaw, it's like, oh, we got to blow it all up and do something entirely new, right? I think what Wikipedia is something that's amazing. Humanity's never had it before, but it has some flaws, and we've talked about a lot of them today. And
limits.
Would you agree that the proposal earlier today in the morning session was to tinker with, do away with, rethink, debate the three core principles, so neutral point of view, verification, and no original research. So should those three, is that at the core? Well, because my view, just to give it to you really briefly, is that those particular principles were put into effect not necessarily to create universal knowledge, but to have all of the crowd, or the amateurs, or the lay actually be able to have something that they would agree on, or that they would strive towards, and so it's for those things are for the types of editors that one would expect on Wikipedia. Perhaps it's not true, but this is sort of. But your views.
Yeah, so to me that would be blowing things up and starting over. Those are kind of core principles, and I think that my view is that that's a bad idea. But I also think that trying to nail down maybe more complex current limitations in the Wikipedia crowdsourcing model is important, so that we can try to put some Band-Aids in, right? Try to use duct tape. So broadband, that is a structural barrier, right? Can we develop, for instance, apps that make it easier to edit Wikipedia, cite sources, et cetera, that will work on the cell phones that are employed in Africa, or that are often used in Africa,
issue, and
Southeast Asia.
They know it. They're skipping broadband, and so they're skipping editing along with it.
Right.
Can we do that?
Right. Another thing I was, describing rural places, right? There's some structural barriers to describing rural places. Language is a structural barrier. Amount of time you have during the day when you can delete the word climate change is another structural barrier. These are all, for me, these are all things that a computer scientist or someone with computational abilities, definitely not just a computer scientist, could begin to think about and develop tools to serve as duct tape, right?
Did Ellen want, and then Tommaso, and then we have to finish.
Yeah, maybe I would like to make a small practical note after you answer this question. Is that possible? So then maybe first Tommaso.
Oh yeah, that was a very simple one. I just wanted to say that when discussing about the flows of Wikipedia or the drawbacks of Wikipedia and how to fix them and whether we should fix them, we should also always keep in mind that Wikipedia part of the problems of Wikipedia comes from the fact that Wikipedia is an encyclopedia, so it's meant to be universal, and it's meant to have a lot of different articles. So sometimes stuff that works for 90% of the article, 95% of the articles creates problem in 5% of the article, which is still like thousands of articles. But can you really fix those 5% without creating other problems elsewhere? So to some extent, I agree with the fact that some degree of flows is inevitable, like structural.
Okay. And then, Fabian, did you want to say a last word, Fabian? Ellen, please?
Yeah, just a practical thing. Remember that I ended my talk with this proposal to have some sort of platform. It doesn't have to be big. It could be, I don't know, it could even be Facebook if nobody here sort of lethally objects to Facebook. But I wondered, does that sound remotely interesting? If so, I'd like to try at least what happens if we do that. We did it for the Memory at War project and it became big. We did it for some other projects and it didn't work, but I would like to try at least. So if people sound sort of, especially, okay, let's try. Thank you, that was it.
Okay, thanks very much. I'd like to thank the audience on the live stream, the audience live, as well as the speaker, the organizational team, and all of the speakers. Thanks very much. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a reception downstairs.